Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the second global series of our seminars for the International Federation of National Teaching Fellows. And tonight we have a wonderful talk entitled A Hopeful Pedagogy, Shakespearean Case Studies. And that is delivered by Lisa Dixon, the University of Northern British Columbia, Professor Shannon Murray from the University of Prince Edward Island, and Jessica Riddle from Bishop's University, all who are 3M fellows in Canada. And we're delighted that you've agreed to give a talk, and we look forward to that. So over to you, Shannon.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Martina, and the IFNTF for making this space for us and for continuing to connect so many of us from around the world who are engaged in teaching and learning and leading when we can't be together in person. And thanks to all of you for coming to hear and talk about hope in higher education. It's a pure pleasure for me to mention my two collaborators, Jessica Riddle, as Martina mentioned, from Bishop's University, a professor, and the Stephen A. Jaroslavsky Chair of Undergraduate Excellence, and Lisa Dixon, both a professor of English at the University of Northern British Columbia and the chair of the 3M Council here in Canada. By the way, her bio says that she's an associate professor, and I'm thrilled to tell you that she's now been promoted. It's very exciting. The three of us, as Martina said, are 3M National Teaching Fellows, all Shakespeareans who happened to get together on a bus trip in Vancouver. While we were sitting together, we discovered a lot of common joys and frustrations, and we've been working together ever since. At the time, I think it's fair to say that all three of us were experiencing a severe hope shortage, more generally about the state of teaching support and development in this country, but more specifically about our own futures as academics. Working together, I think I can speak for all of us, has made us much more hopeful about our own careers. We share a belief that teaching is an essentially hopeful occupation, and that there's a deep hopefulness in the specific area we work in. We were just talking before we started about Lisa's Shakespeare class, all tragedy all the time, and we even find the tragedies hopeful. The study of Shakespeare, we believe, can help students strengthen their own critical hope and critical empathy muscles. And we're in the last stages, or at least we think we're in the last stages of a book. We hope we're in the last stages of a book on that subject. But most recently, and largely due to the heavy lifting of Dr. Dixon, we started a collaborative space, which we intend to be a gathering space for, there we are, a gathering space for reflections, resources, and conversation about literature, but also about learning in higher education. And if at the end of this you find that you have some interest in the transformative value of critical hope and critical empathy in our classrooms and in the world, we invite you to come visit our blogs and our workshops and podcasts there. We're always looking for more kindred spirits to join us in our conversations. We have a pretty simple structure for this session. I'm going to sketch out a few principles for teaching with hope in mind. And then Lisa and Jessica will each offer a concrete example of how they build hope into the very structures of their courses. With what time we have left over, we're going to turn things over to you to hear where you find hope in your own teaching. So, from me, a few introductory thoughts. First, we should establish what we mean when we say we're talking about critical hope. It's not merely wishing passively for things to get better. That doesn't strike us as especially useful. It's not a lazy optimism that merely trusts that all will be well in the end. And so much of our work, some of you can probably guess, builds on the work of Paulo Freire and bell hooks and others. And Lisa the other day reminded me of Paulo Freire's way of thinking about critical hope. It involves three things: your own agency, that is your ability to affect change. It requires reflection, that is the ability to understand your own circumstances and your actions in context. And it's always future focused, a forward-looking process and not an end in itself. So critical hope for Freire involves agency, reflection, and futurity. And I also like Maria Pavova's formulation here. Critical hope involves that connection between critique and hope. One without the other is not going to be sufficient for change. And I just came upon this. I really like this passage as well from Charisse Bach. What she's suggesting is that what's essential in this kind of hope, in critical hope, is both a clear-eyed understanding of the world and a firm belief that that world can be better than it is, different than it is, but also better than it is. For my own part, when I'm thinking about deploying hope in my practice, I think about 3 places: hope in my own discipline, hope in my daily classroom practice and my course design, and hope in my personal approach to the world, both as a teacher, but also just as a human being. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've already suggested that Lisa, Jessica, and I see Shakespeare's plays, the collaborativeness, the complexity and ambiguity of meaning, the sheer humanness of it all, as deeply hopeful. And I was actually going to talk about that, but I think I'm going to use an example that came to me just yesterday, when a student who was talking through a draft of her paper summed up what she thought was, she didn't use the word hopeful, but what she thought was beautiful about the work that she was doing. She was writing about trauma in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. There's a tale in there that involves a rape and then the response to the rape. And she said that she found it so strengthening to be able to see other people at other times in other cultures going through the same sorts of things that she had and getting through them, coming out the other side. So an analysis of the future-facing hope in a 600-year-old poem, she found strengthened her own. She was, by the way, really shocked that that had happened. She didn't think she'd find anything of value in this old stuff. Now, before we move on to the next, I just want to give you a couple of moments of reflection. So those of you who are teaching, whatever you're teaching, what is it in your own disciplines that you find essentially hopeful? And if you just want to think about that, that's fine. If you want to jump in for a moment, you're welcome to do that. You could also put something in the chat, but I'll give you a couple of moments to think that through. Hey, Joe, you just caught us while people are doing a reflection break. That's why we're quiet.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. I had to. I have a PhD student who is submitting, and I needed to. It took a little bit longer, but
don't worry, don't worry. So I'm seeing some wonderful stuff in the chat. Does anybody want to speak to any of that? We are a small group, so you're welcome just to put on your mic and talk.
Yeah, so James here from the UK, just to say that all of my students are part-time, mature local government officers, and what I find essentially hopeful is that they're able to use their localities and issues and possibilities to kill two birds with one stone, that they're able to turn in an assignment that at the same time something very similar is going to be maybe a report to their council so that they can bring about some local change.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. Anyone else want to share one?
I could share something. So I'm in biosciences, and when I was head of teaching, the opening statement of my opening talk to the new first years was, we've kind of screwed up the planet. It's up to you to help us out. So, giving them that idea that they can make a substantive contribution to to the future of our ecosystems and the future of the world, really.
Yeah, there's where not only do we need hope, but our students need hope to believe that change is possible. Yeah, I was talking the other day to one of my colleagues who's in climate science lab here. And she says that's her struggle. She needs her students to know the way the world is right now, but she also needs them not to give up and despair in their second year. She needs, to make them think that there's a possibility for change. Those are lovely examples, and there are a few more in the chat as well. So the first way that we locate hope is in looking at our own disciplines and seeing what's hopeful in them. And for the three of us, making hope a part of all of our decisions about course design is also really essential. It's also important for us to talk to our students about why we're doing these things and to embed hope in our conversation with them. So if I give them a number of different choices, I give them agency in what they're doing, I want to be able to tell them why that is. And we talk about hope as one of the things that's supposed to come from that. So anything that involves an emphasis on development or growth, agency or choice, all of those things that we know are good practice, active and experiential learning, ungrading, all of them give students the sense that there is change that's possible, that it's not merely a matter of submitting something and getting a grade, that there's something essentially hopeful in the openness and the movement to develop their own learning. And we tell them, because they're supposed to be co-constructing learning with us, contributing to the knowledge and the change that they want to see in the world. So we see it embedded in our practice as well, sometimes in very small ways, like allowing a variety of different possible choices, and sometimes in multiple submissions or drafting or that sort of thing. And we also think of critical hope in ourselves. And for this last level, I want to speak personally. And from a moment that is, it's a very challenging moment for many of us. It would be a challenging moment even if there weren't a pandemic going on. The more I find myself baking hope into my classes, into the fabric of my classes. That was a terrible mixed metaphor. Sorry. Baking into a fabric, baking them into the pie of my classes. Or the more I find myself talking and writing about hope with Jessica and Lisa, the more hopeful I become. So theorizing it, putting it into practice, they actually make me a more hopeful person. And that's no small thing. After more than 35 years in the classroom in my institution, shrinking support and resources, in the middle of a pandemic, I need as much hope as I can muster. For many of us, an academic career is a really long and challenging path with a lot of obstacles on the way that could convince us to abandon hope or to believe that things only fall apart, that they don't get better. So I want to end my bit by suggesting that hope really requires practice. And like any virtue, if you practice it in good times, it's going to be there when you need it in the bad. So now I'm going to turn things over to my two collaborators who are going to talk about specific, innovative, and I think really exciting ways they transform their classrooms into hopeful spaces. And Lisa, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so here is the question. What do I love? Could I just have a pause and just ask, has anybody in their job as a professional ever been asked what you love? Has anyone ever been asked that question? before? Anyone? I'm getting, oh, excellent. Good, Pat. I'm very glad to hear that. Good, wonderful, wonderful. Just from me. Yes, this is good. I'm very glad to hear that somebody's asking that question because I asked that of my students and they were very nonplussed. They were a little bit thrown by that question. No one had ever asked them that before in the context of their learning. So I asked them that question. And as part of a reflection about co-creation of the course, designing the course together. So can we go to the next slide, Shannon? So one of the things that I ask my students to do is to create a learning philosophy for themselves, either as part of a larger portfolio project or as an in-class exercise. And this year, I've been really thinking about that question. What do I love? And what are the possibilities of actually starting from that question as opposed to starting from other kinds of questions, which I'll get to in a moment. So I put this exercise to them. It was a 3-step exercise that follows the name, claim, and aim model that we've talked about elsewhere. And that webinar and the resources are available on the website. And so there's a whole philosophy behind this structure. But I structured it around these 3 steps: an individual reflection, an individual and group reflection, and then a group discussion about the values that we want to build into the course. And this is drawing on those Freirean principles of agency, reflection, and futurity. The idea that you can change the world if you can reflect on your circumstances and if you are aware that you have the capacity to make those changes. So I just started out by asking them, just tell me, just list, you don't have to tell anybody, do it on a piece of paper, everything that you love. And don't edit it or censor it or do any of those kinds of things. It took quite a bit of prompting because they weren't sure what was going on. And they, like, can I say I love my dog? It's like, yes, say you love your dog. So we just spent a few minutes just writing down everything that we love. Then we moved on to the next stage, which was the claim piece, where we start thinking about the underlying principles that we associate with those things. So we asked them to sort them into categories. Some of these things are like these other things, not to think about too much about why we're grouping them together at first. And then once we had some discrete categories, we chose one, each person chose one, and started to think about what are the qualities or values that underpin or shape or create relationships between all of these things. And then we had them move into a partnership or a group so that they could present those ideas to each other. And get some feedback to help them to articulate those ideas and to clarify those ideas for themselves. And then the final step was we moved into the aim phase, which was to identify how we can actually live the things that we love in our classroom space. So it might seem a long distance, as one of my students said in his reflection yesterday, it's a long distance from I love my dog to what am I doing in my classroom? Until we start thinking about, well, what does it mean to love your dog, to have somebody who's supportive, to have somebody who's there for you, somebody that you can care for, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to dig into some of those deeper values that we have that shape and motivate us in our learning. Or if those values are not nurtured, that can actually demotivate us in those space. And so we asked about, well, how can we actually build those into the practice of the classes? So what kind of mindsets do we need to bring? What sorts of conditions do we need to have in place? For example, can we break our classroom space and make it more amenable to being able to talk to each other than having everybody sit in rows, for example? And what kind of activities could we do? And we generated a menu of those kinds of things. And I'm going to come back to the idea of trust in just a moment. So could we go to the next slide? So we had them gather their ideas together and to think about what those values were. So there's a few outcomes of doing this exercise, which at first seems a little bit weird. I had to rely on a kind of compliance, which I'm hoping to dismantle. So there's a little bit of a problem there. But to ask them to think about those values. So there's a few things that we can take away from that. So for example, the reflection path helps them to identify their values. It bridges their lives it makes a bridge between the lives that they live and the lives that they live in the classroom to make them or help them to understand that what motivates them and what they value can exist in both of those places. So it helps us to think of ourselves as whole people rather than people who have to leave most of ourselves at the door. It helps them to articulate those motivating values in a clear way, to surface them, to bring them into their own attention so that they can take intentional action. It helps us decide what we're going to do. If we're not sure what to do, we go back to our list, and it helps to build trust. But one of the things that emerged from this experience was this really beautiful picture of students and what they want and what they need, which is a very different picture than I get when I come at this question from a different direction. So what emerged out of the conversations in both of the classrooms was what appears to be a contradiction between safety and challenge. So they want safety, but they also want to be challenged in order to grow. And what bridged that for them was compassion, empathy, and a commitment to deep listening and understanding of each other. And that, I have to tell you, made me a little bit verklempt, I'm not gonna lie, because we get a very, very different picture of what's going on in that community than we get if we start from what I call deficit questions, right? Why aren't the students doing what I tell them? Why are the students apathetic? Why are the students lazy and entitled? Like, we hear those questions in the discourse all the time, which starts from barriers rather than starting from those really generative and beautiful values. So, and which basically make us blame the salmon for the brutalities of the dam. So it helps us to shift our attention and to address these questions in a different way. And can I just show the last slide? So then what we did is we built a Padlet. We put all of the posters up on the Padlet, and I asked for feedback. We're just at the very beginning of this process, so we don't have a lot on the Padlet yet. But this is the key piece. In order for this process to work, we have to draw on the fourth value that Freire mentions, or the fourth necessary condition of agency, futurity, and reflection, and that is trust. Students have to know that if they want to make a change, that we can discuss that and that change will actually happen. So the feedback piece is really, really important to come back to these kinds of questions of value. Are we living up to those values? What do we need to do different? Because I don't want to ever be in the position as I once was when I asked students, well, if you didn't like this and I asked you why didn't I ask you if we could change it and you never wanted to change it, why was that? And they said, well, we didn't believe you. And so that element of trust is absolutely foundational to hopeful practices. And that trust has to come from a lived experience of return, assessment, reflection, and change. And the students really liked this exercise. They associated it with the work that they do in thinking about writing essays, for example, starting from broad brainstorming, sorting, and then thinking about a thesis, right? So they were able to apply it in a bunch of different ways. And I also got some good feedback about how we could formalize that a little bit more to make more space for quiet students, for example, to be able to be heard. So this student here, for example, has asked to have it put up on a Padlet for several days so that they could think about it and be heard. So that iterative process is absolutely foundational. And I love this exercise. I've done it with faculty. This is the first time I did it with students. And I told them I wasn't sure how it was going to go, but we were going to try it and see. And it was really so beautiful, this picture of these incredibly generous, thoughtful, caring, committed, and engaged students that this exercise kind of brought to the surface for me. So that was my experience with a hopeful strategy, which I'm obviously going to try again and develop a little bit more. 12 seconds to spare.
Oh, that was beautiful. Well done. And so I'll pass things over now to Jessica for hers.
Thank you so much. And I will also start my timer so that we're leaving enough time for you all to sort of come with your own hopeful practices. But I should just say before, I was not planning on this, but Dr. Dixon did this whole exercise with me one day when we were locked in some cabin somewhere, maybe in Canada. And she asked that question, what do you love? And she doodled through the place, and I framed it, and I have it in my workspace, and I revisit it often because I have to remind myself, especially in moments of despair, what do I love? What drives me? How do I plug in my batteries? And you'll see, actually, it's so funny. I wasn't planning on talking about it, but it is perfectly framed to the talk that I prepared for you all today. So don't advance a slide yet. Shannon, I just want to frame the journey to this talk. And it was a difficult one to prepare because given 10 minutes to talk about hopeful pedagogies, after Shannon and Lisa and I have just spent 5 years writing about it, was no small feat. I've been in a flap for the last month, and I've written 4 different talks. So I started with a talk on how Cordelia from King Lear teaches us about consent in the classroom and how we exercise our critical empathy muscles. A few weeks ago, I changed course and decided to write a manifesto about how Shakespeare helps us tackle 21st century wicked problems. So hope in action. And then I thought, no, I want to talk about witches in Macbeth. And so I talked about how these witches create a new model for us of educational leadership that I termed leadership from the edges. So how do you work in the margins to enact hopeful culture change? But then I finally came back to the fundamentals. What does hope look like for our disciplines, our classrooms, and ourselves? And in my moments of despair, I do the exercise that Lisa outlined for you, the sort of naming, claiming, and aiming. And I also go back to Parker Palmer, who gave me some advice in The Courage to Teach that I revisit often in an iterative process. And he says, when you are unsure about your path, make sure that you connect to the mentors who evoked us and with the subject of study that chose us to make sense of the forces that converge in our lives. And so I thought that it was appropriate, speaking to the International Federation of Teaching Fellows from around the world today, that I went back to the beginning of my own fellowship journey and reread my 3M dossier, which I signed and submitted on August the 16th, 2014. So more than 7 years ago. And in going backwards, I found a path forward into this present moment. And in remembering what I love, thank you, Lisa, for always reminding us. I remember who I am and where I find these hopeful selves in discipline in classrooms and in these journeys. So Shannon, could you go to the slide? What do I love, or what do we love? This is a beautiful photo of us on Shakespearean. The 3 of us pre-COVID would take these amazing cast of characters, students and students of life, about 20-25 people, to the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario, the 2nd largest Shakespeare repertory theatre in the world, second only to the RSC in Stratford-upon-Avon. We create these spaces where we map our classroom onto a small town town and into this theater space, in the audiences, in the aisles, in the hallways, in the practice spaces, in the costume ateliers, everywhere. And we understand that the making of meaning is in co-design, it's inhabiting these spaces. It is energizing us all as co-designers and as co-learners. So that is what I love. That is what Shakespeare does. When you go into a theater and you're there as an audience member, you're not a passive consumer, you are an active participant. We have really very strict instructions Shakespeare wants us to follow about how to be an audience member. We need to harness our imaginations. We need to make up for the imperfections of the actors. We need to imagine that this great wooden O holds the vasty fields of France. That is exciting, right? That is three-dimensional. It's kinetic, it is energetic, and it requires all of us to create something together that is greater than the sum of our individual parts. And when I went back to my teaching dossier, I'm going to just read the introductory paragraph, this sort of audacious young human who thought she was very clever. I'm just going to read this really quickly. It says, when I was in graduate school, I used to joke that if academia didn't work out, I'd become a party planner. My flippant remark elicited the expected response, laughter, largely due to the ostensible incongruity between the weighty cerebral world of academia in contrast with the ephemeral and seemingly superficial pursuits of the party. And yet, as I reflect on my almost 20 years in the academy as a learner, a teacher, I've come to realize not that we take academia too seriously, but that we don't take party planning seriously enough. This is myself 7 years ago making a case for the party. And I go on to trace how the history of Western civilization is to trace the history of the party, the intentional creation of these formal and informal spaces in taverns, coffee houses, salons, laboratories, where intellectuals from many different backgrounds, scientists and philosophers and artists and poets interacted, and where these collisions of creativity sparked innovations that led to deep cultural transformations. So that was my premise then. And in fact, going back, I still fundamentally believe that. But if you could, Shannon, advance the slide, what do we do when we can't be in the spaces that we love? So, enter COVID stage left. I've been thinking about COVID as a kind of Shakespearean character who has sort of crashed our play and changed some of the focus. Whether or not they are the chorus from Henry V, who's always commenting on the action of the play, or a god from a mask descending to pass judgment or resolve a tricky thing, or even a revenge character straight out of a morality play reminding us of our basest qualities. COVID is a kind of character and animating our conversations. This is, and really sort of inspiring a series of the conversations, about what does a classroom look like in the time of COVID? What is pandemic pedagogy? What does higher education look like in a post-pandemic world? And so there have been a lot of hand wringings and sky is falling narratives, and people are gasping, I think, for hope now more than ever. So how do we name, aim, and claim this? So Shannon, if you could advance to the Caputo slide, please. One of the ways in which I name, aim, and claim it is to understand that COVID gave us a chance to go back to the basics and to understand that hope is found in the complexity, in the messiness, in the conversations, and on the edges. So I used to think in my teaching philosophy that my approach to a classroom was first to invite students to the party, to the class, and then create conditions where they are delighted and they interact and they build community, and then equip them to go on their own educational journeys and quests. But I've added a fourth bit here, and my new approach in COVID is to invite them to co-host the intellectual revels with me. So what does that look like? Shannon, if you could give a little familiar go over, you'll see a Teams screenshot, right? All of us have been living in this world for the last 18 plus months. And so how do you create spaces when you want to be kinetic and three-dimensional? And in fact, you're two-dimensional and virtual, and you can't smell people, you can't touch them, you can't encounter them in actual physical space. So I went back to my basics. I distilled my teaching philosophy, which was 2 pages, into 4 words. And those 4 words were community, curiosity, consent, and compassion. So I took those into the design of my classes. And then in the delivery, I realized that COVID gave me opportunities to host new spaces for engagement, to increase accessibility and inclusion, and to double down on individualized learning. So one of the things that I was able to do that I hadn't been able to do for the last 10 years was to host virtual play readings. So on Tuesday nights before our Wednesday class, we got together for 3 hours and we read out loud together on a Teams channel the particular play we were studying the next day. I'd always wanted to do it. I used to do it before children and before, winter drives onto campus and fighting for parking and doing all of that kind of work. All of a sudden, the virtual space released us into this world where we could do it from the comfort of our homes in our pajamas with a nice cup of tea or coffee. And so creating those virtual play readings allowed me to create those communities, those informal spaces where we could do collisions of creativity. And I invited Shannon and Lisa and friends and colleagues from all over, not just my students, to participate and then to comment in the chats, to be able to sort of bring in conversations and insights and queries as we read that play out loud and built something together. So I'm just going to go to the final slide, if you will indulge me, my metaphor. I'm coming back to this party, this notion of hosting a party and the importance of hosting intellectual revels. I've started to think in COVID and now about hosting hope-filled spaces. So if you think about this as a party, and in Quebec, we use the apéro. You come, you have light food and your first drink. You come and you sort of cross the threshold into the party and you build a community. You meet the people, you sort of have a conversation, you sort of loosen up. And this is where I'm building community with virtual play readings. And then I think about the asynchronous content as the charcuterie platter. Okay, I got people in the door, they took off their coats, they took off their shoes. Now they come into this sort of banquet where they can choose. Do I want an olive? Do I want some cheese? Would I like a little salami or some prosciutto? So I created asynchronous content so that people could choose what they wanted. So they could deliver the content on their own time, in micro lectures, in videos, in podcasts, and in chapters and in writing, so that they could choose what they wanted in an individualized way. And then the main course, that live classroom, opened up the space. Instead of the tyranny of content, we got to play and workshop and close read and build things together and build consent and co-design. And the one final piece of a hosting of a meal, whether you like a nice sweet dessert, or if you're in Quebec and you prefer a sort of cheese course, at the end, to cleanse your palate, I created a compassion dessert where I flipped office hours. I created open drop-in walk and talks. I renamed my office hours as student hours, and I built this kind of space of revelry and festivity that for me filled me with hope every time I connected with them, and allowed them to then think about what their role is as their own party planners. So that's my case study in a nutshell. But thinking about the festive and hope-filled spaces through the lens of a party is something I'm really starting to play with even more intentionally. Shannon?
So thank you, you two. We have some time and we were going to do breakout rooms, but there aren't as many, there aren't enough people for that. So let's just have a chat and we could start. Shall I take the slides down, Lisa and Jessica?
Yeah.
So we can